Good morning, guys. Welcome to this course on ethics. Today, in the first lecture, we shall discuss about normative ethics. Ethics can be broadly divided into three branches: normative ethics, meta-ethics, and applied ethics. Normative ethics basically deals with the question what is right, what is wrong, what is a right action or a wrong action, or who is a good person in character or a bad person in character. Metaethics does not deal with the question of what is right and wrong, but deals with the fundamental epistemological question. How do we come to know what is a right action or what is a wrong action? Applied ethics deals with applying the norms of the normative ethics in various disciplines like science, technology, engineering, business, or other professions. The issues like euthanasia, abortion, and other issues fall under applied ethics. Now, having said that, let us now discuss today the normative ethics. Normative ethics has two major schools. The first school is called Consequentialism, and the second school is called non-consequentialism. In order to understand that, let us begin with the classical case, the case known as the trolley problem. There is a trolley which runs at a high speed on a given track, and let us assume you are the driver of the trolley. As you keep the course, you realize there are 5 people working on the trolley at a time when they are not supposed to be working. You cannot stop the trolley. Even if you try to stop, you will run over those 5 people and end up killing them. But luckily you realize there is another track turning to the right. You can turn right, but you have a difficulty there. There is one person working on that track who is supposed to be working at that time. Now you have the choice and the dilemma. Should you keep the course on the track on which you are running the trolley, or should you turn right? If you keep the course, you will end up killing 5 people. If you turn to the right, you will kill only one person. What would you do as the driver? Think for a moment and think of a response in your mind. Most students in the past, when I ask this question, tell me that they would turn right and run over that one person. Because they say, well, killing one person is better than killing 5 people. The logic is 1 versus 5 or 1 versus many. If you can avoid killing 5 people by killing one person, then better do it. Now, this is known as the Caiaphas syndrome. You know the famous episode in the Bible when Caiaphas the high priest says at one point in time, it is better for one person to die than for all of us to perish. And that is why it is known as the Caiaphas syndrome. Now, if you change the case slightly differently, instead of you now as running the trolley as a driver, you are standing on the bridge under which the trolley is going to pass through. You are an innocent bylooker. Now you realize that next to you is a fat man, so fat that you think by pushing him down, he would stop the trolley, but he will end up dead. But you will save those 5 people on the track. What would you do? Would you push that fat man to save those 5 people on the track? Or would you let the trolley run over those 5 people? When I ask this question, the students often change their response. They say, well, they would let the trolley run over the 5 people. Now, you don't no longer think killing one person is better than killing 5 people. So in each situation, we make different choice. Of course, there is a huge difference between killing one person and letting 5 people die. There is a motive behind killing this person. You intentionally do this act, and that is why your response changes. Now let us take yet another case. You are a doctor in a multi-specialist hospital. There are 5 patients under your care. Each one of them need an organ transplant, and they are waiting for the perfect match, without which they will die. Each of those persons have family. They have commitments to their family. And they also are of great standing in the society. They contribute a lot to the society. It is at this time a homeless person walks into your hospital because he has just little stomach pain. Upon examination, you find he is perfectly healthy and the stomach pain is only a minor ailment and it can be healed with a simple medicine. But you think for a while and realize, after all, this is a homeless person. He has nobody to care for. In fact, he has no reason to live for anyone. So you think, I shall give him a painless death and take all those functional organs and do the transplant for those who need. And those people have families to take care of. What would you do? You as a doctor, would you kill the 5 person in order to save the lives? Would you kill the homeless person in order to save the lives of those 5 persons under your care? If you say you would do that, then you belong to the consequentialist school. As the name suggests, consequentialism basically means you judge an action by the consequence it produces. An action is right if it produces good consequence. It is wrong if it produces bad consequence. Therefore, an action is to be judged by the consequences it produces. A right action is one which produces good consequences. A wrong action is one which produces bad consequences. So the principle that consequentialism adopts is the end justifies the means. The end here means the end result, the consequence. The means is the method by which you reach that consequence. What matters is the end result, the consequence. The means doesn't matter. In fact, even if the means are not so acceptable ones, they can be justified by the end result those means produce. Contrary to this, you have the school called non-consequentialism. It is the exact opposite of consequentialism. An action is not to be judged right or wrong by the consequences it produces. Consequences may be good, but the action in itself may be wrong. So you need to judge an action regardless of its consequences. A right action is the one which is right on its own merit, not because of the consequences it produces. The wrong action is wrong on its own merit, not because of the bad consequences it produces. So the principle this school adopts is the end does not justify the means. This school is also often known as deontology, and I shall discuss about this school little later. Today we shall only focus on the schools of consequentialism. The schools of consequentialism has 2 other schools within that. But before we proceed to that, apart from consequentialism and non-consequentialism, we also have what is known as virtue ethics in normative ethics. Unlike consequentialism and non-consequentialism, it does not focus on individual actions. Rather, it makes judgment on the person as a whole. It is not interested in passing judgment on the actions of the individual, whether they are right or wrong, but whether the person is morally good, whether the person has a good moral character. Again, we shall take up this school a little later. Now, as I said a while ago, consequentialism has two important schools. Of course, there are many schools, but these two are the major ones. They are ethical egoism and utilitarianism. On the left of the screen, you find the image of Ayn Rand, a Russian-born American citizen who is a champion of the school called ethical egoism. On the right-hand side, you have the images of two eminent English philosophers of 19th century, Sir Jeremy Bentham on the extreme right, and to the left of him is Sir John Stuart Mill, a student of Jeremy Bentham. They both are advocates of utilitarianism. Let us now focus on each of these schools for a while. Ethical egoism is rooted in the ancient philosophy called Epicureanism. The school is named after the philosopher Epicurus. Oftentimes, you might have heard of Epicureanism in a very caricature way. People say things like, the Epicurean philosophy is just eat, drink, and make merry, for tomorrow is not yours. In fact, Epicurus never said that. It is often a way in which he is critiqued. Epicurus basically said, what is most important in life is seeking happiness. And this is called the hedonistic principle. Hedone in Greek means pleasure or happiness. So we all seek happiness and we try to avoid pain in our life. So he believed a good life is the one that makes you happy, a pleasant life. So you should try to avoid pain. But what is pleasant or happiness is not only the immediate pleasure that you obtain, the short-term pleasures that you get, but long-term happiness. It involves a certain pursuit of long-term goals, not immediate satisfaction of some carnal pleasures as is often portrayed as eat, drink, and make merry. And that is a caricature of his philosophy. Now, ethical egoism accepts this hedonistic principle, namely, what matters most in life is happiness. In fact, happiness is an intrinsic moral value. By intrinsic, what we mean is that it is a value on its own merit. It is not dependent on any other value to be a value. So that is why it is intrinsic. It is not an extrinsic moral value. Now, Epicureanism serves as the basis or the root of ethical egoism. Now, ethical egoism basically is a philosophy which says an action is right if it promotes my happiness or it promotes my self-interest. My self-interest are the ones that matter the most. My happiness matters the most. So it is a consequentialist school because you judge an action to be right or wrong based on the consequences it produces for me as the moral agent. If it produces happiness for me, then it is a right action. If it does not produce us happiness or it produces pain for me, then it is a wrong action. But again, ethical egoism has further divisions. Act ethical egoism and rule ethical egoism. Act ethical egoism focuses on the individual act. Let us say act A and there is an act B. If I do act A, that produces happiness for me, or if that produces my self-interest, then it is a right action. And if I do act B, if it does not produce happiness for me or does not promote my self-interest, then that is a wrong action. So I would choose act A over act B. Now, rule ethical egoism does not focus on the individual act. It chooses a certain set of rules to live by, and then if I live by these rules, whether it produces happiness to me or it promotes my self-interest, then it is rule ethical egoism. If by following this rule, am I going to get the maximum happiness for me? If then that action that is a result of following the rule is a right action, otherwise it is a wrong action. Let us now apply this theory to a case. Let us assume you are Peter and you are working in a renowned company. For many years, you have been working with vast amount of experience in that field, and there is a new post open for the vice president, and you are eligible for that, and perhaps you are one of the most eligible candidates for that. Along with you is Paul. He is also as efficient as you are. He is your competitor. Now, when the recruiters are assessing your files along with those of Paul, you accidentally come across one of the confidential files of Paul that he forgetfully left in the cafeteria. Out of curiosity, you open the file, and then when you browse through it, you realize that Paul has received a memo, a warning from the previous company where he worked for the failure of duty. Now, if the recruiters get it, that will go against Paul, but that will be in your favor. Now, you are an ethical egoist. You have three options: destroy the demo, hand over the memo to the recruiters, or let the recruiters find the memo on their own. You make some moves by which you make sure that they get in their hands. As an act ethical egoist, what would you do? As a rule ethical egoist, what would you do? I shall ask you to reflect this question. Maybe I shall post this in the Google Classroom. Think about it. Is there a difference in your decision if you are an act ethical egoist or a rule ethical egoist? Think about it, and then we'll come back to it later. Now let us try and evaluate the moral argument of this theory. Every theory has to be assessed. To assess those theory or to evaluate the theory, we need to apply certain criteria. And I choose to apply these three criteria to see whether this moral theory is a tenable theory. The first criterion I propose is that whether this moral theory is consistent with considered moral judgment. The second criterion is whether it is consistent with common moral experience. And the third criterion is whether it is useful in solving moral problems. Now let me explain each of these criteria briefly. When I say consistent with considered moral judgments, what I mean is people in the history of the world have reflected sufficiently about certain moral principles, and they have considered carefully certain moral cases, and they have a general understanding about it. They have made a judgment about certain moral behavior as that is acceptable or not acceptable, and that would be the considered moral judgment. For example, generally people think after careful reflection that killing is morally wrong. So that would be a considered moral judgment. The second criterion is whether it is consistent with common moral experience. Common moral experience is the everyday experience that we have in our moral issues or moral choice. For example, we all have the experience of treating one another with respect or helping one another in need. These are some of those things which make social life possible. This is a common moral experience. Treating people equally and fairly is a common moral experience. The third criterion, whether it is useful in solving moral problems, that is self-explanatory. Now let us see whether this theory somehow fulfills all these three criteria. In fact, this theory fails all these three criteria. It is not consistent with considered moral judgment. Let us take the example. You are an ethical egoist, you are a son of a wealthy merchant, and you don't get to enjoy the wealth, and you think it is only by enjoying the wealth you will promote the best self-interest of yours. But there is an impediment. As long as your father lives, you will not be able to enjoy the wealth, and therefore you will not be able to promote your self-interest. So you decide you will kill your father. And you will end up justifying that act by saying that action is right because that promotes my self-interest. Would that be acceptable? The considered moral judgment would say, no, killing is wrong. So it fails the first criterion. The second criterion is whether it is consistent with common moral experience. Common moral experience tells us that we treat each other equally. We treat morally relevant people equally. Now, by morally relevant people, I mean people who are capable of making moral judgments. People who are sane, people who are sober. They are not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or people who have lost their mind. So these morally relevant people are to be treated equally. Now, this theory suggests that your interests are more important than the interests of others. So in some way, you put yourself above the rest of the people. So it is not inconsistent with common moral experience. It is not useful in solving moral problems. Let me give you an example. Now you are an ethical egoist and someone comes to you and asks for a guidance. So you tell that person, as an ethical egoist, do what promotes your self-interest. But let us assume, if that person does what promotes his or her self-interest, it will go against your self-interest. So as an ethical egoist, you have to promote your self-interest, but when you advise somebody else to promote his or her self-interest, which may go against your self-interest, you still end up advising that person that way as an ethical egoist. So it is contradictory and conflicting. It is not helpful in solving moral problems. Now let us look at the basis of this theory and try and see whether we can evaluate the basis of the theory. The basis of the theory is psychological egoism. Now, psychological egoism is an idea that is given by Sir Thomas Hobbes, another English philosopher. Now, Thomas Hobbes believed that we are naturally selfish. That is what we are. So, psychological egoism is descriptive of our nature. It merely states our psyche, our nature. We are egoist by our very nature. And that is inspired by the idea of Thomas Hobbes. But then, from psychological egoism, ethical egoism makes a leap. Because we are naturally egoist, we seek our self-interest naturally, we ought to do things that promote our self-interest. And we cannot do things that would not promote our self-interest. Now, at the moment we say we ought to do what promotes our self-interest, now that becomes ethical egoism. It does not merely describe what we are, it demands us to be what we should be. In this case, we ought to be seeking self-interest, or we ought to be selfish. Now, let us look at the basis and evaluate whether that description of that we are naturally selfish is an acceptable description. Let us take the example of a mother. A mother who takes care of the newborn, spending sleepless nights. Is she selfish? Does she promote her self-interest? Well, the proponents of ethical egoism would say, yes, she does. After all, by taking care of the baby, she feels happy. Therefore, she is taking care of the baby. Now, the ethical egoists are confusing motives with consequences. The mother takes care of the baby not because she wants to get happiness out of that action. She takes care of her baby in an altruistic way, but as a natural consequence, she derives her own happiness. So ethical egoism seems to be mixing up her motive with the consequence. The mother does not have the motive of getting happiness in taking care of her baby by spending sleepless nights. Rather, it is a byproduct. It is a consequence. There is also another critique that we can lay out against this happiness principle. Now, happiness cannot be achieved by its own. Happiness can be achieved only by pursuing other goals. How do you want to be happy? Well, I want to be happy by engaging myself meaningfully in good friendship or by engaging myself in reading some good literature. So these are the different goals that lead us to happiness. We must have other goals to have happiness. Now, this is the critique that is given by Joel Feiberg. He calls this a problem with the happiness principle. Now, let us move on to the next school called the Utilitarianism. Remember, this is also a consequentialist school. This is also based on the Hellenistic principle of Epicurus. This also accepts happiness as the intrinsic moral good. But this theory is different from ethical egoism because right action is what produces good consequences not only for me but for the vast majority of the people. What makes an action right is the consequences that it has for the greatest number of people. A right action is one which maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people and minimizes pain for the greatest number of people. So there is a balance between happiness or pleasure over pain. And you consider everyone, not just you. And that is what makes it different from ethical egoism. This theory is very simple and straightforward. It's not very complicated at all. And most of the time, people are naturally utilitarian. We look whether it is producing happiness for the vast majority of the people. Suppose we are 100 students in the class, we say if 90% of the students think that we can have class alternative days, that is what promotes the interest of the majority of the people in the class, or it produces happiness for the vast majority of the people, then that will be the right thing to do. But also, it treats everybody equally. Unlike ethical egoism, which treats the self in a more sophisticated way, in a better way than others, this treats everyone equally because everyone's happiness is equally counted. Though we may not be able to cater to the happiness of everyone, but their opinion is taken seriously in order to assess whether the maximum number of people get happiness. Now, Bentham is the founder of the school, Sir Jeremy Bentham, and he believed that happiness is an intrinsic moral value, just like ethical egoism, which believed that happiness is an intrinsic moral value. Now, he also thought that happiness can be quantified. It can be measured, just like we can measure other material things like rice, dal, sugar, and oil. We can find some way of measuring it. The amount of happiness is what we need to look for. How much people are going to be happy. So it is the aggregate of the happiness of all people put together that counts. It is not only how much happiness is distributed among people, but how much happiness, the happiness of all the people put together count. So let us say now there are again 100 students in the class. Now, 70% of you think that this class is important for your life, and then you give about 80% in terms of its importance. There are other 20 people who think it is important, and then they give 70% to that. And the last 10% they give 60%. Now you multiply 10 into 60, 20 into 70, 70 into 80. Now 100 into 100 makes 10,000. There are 10,000 units of happiness. Now if you put together all these other aggregates, it will come to, anything comes closer to 10,000, then this is right. Teaching ethics is the right action. Now he comes up with some criteria as to how we can measure happiness. He gives 7 criteria. The first criterion is intensity. How intense this happiness is. How profound happiness is. So it is not some kind of shallow, superficial kind of happiness, but something that is very profound, very intense. The second criterion is the duration. So it is not a happiness that is lived for a momentary, for a moment, for a short while, for a short duration, but something that is lived for lifelong. The third criterion is propinquity. Propinquity means nearness. How near this happiness is. Now I am going to do this action, and the result of it is going to be the happiness for the maximum number of people. How soon they will get this happiness. You cannot say now 50 years from now you'll get the happiness. Then it is not worth considering. The fourth criterion is certainty. How certain are we? How sure are we that this action is going to produce happiness for the greatest number of people? You cannot be unsure about it. If you are not certain, then again it's not worth considering. The fifth criterion is fecundity. That means this happiness that people get, the vast majority of people, how much does it propagate itself? How much it regenerates itself into further happiness, and it goes on. So it multiplies itself. So that is what is known as fecundity. The sixth criterion is purity. The happiness is or must be devoid of pain. How pure happiness can it be? Pure happiness means the pain should be as little as possible or nothing at all if possible. So that would be the purity of happiness. The seventh criterion is to what extent? To what extent people are going to be happy? How many people are going to be made happy by this? So these are the 7 criteria by which Bentham thinks we can quantify happiness, and therefore his utilitarianism is called utilitarianism of quantity. Differing from him, Sir John Stuart Mill comes up with utilitarianism of quality. For Mill, it is not merely the quantity that matters. What matters is the quality of pleasure. So he thinks there are different kinds of pleasure. There is a hierarchy of pleasure, some more important and some less important. So he says there are lower forms of pleasure and higher forms of pleasure. Now, lower forms of pleasure would be something to do with everyday activity like eating, drinking, having party, or having a happy sex life, and so on and so forth. Now, that would be a lower form of pleasure. Now, higher form of pleasure is to engage in some nobler activity, engaging in works of literature, philosophy, or watching a nice Shakespearean play. This would be higher forms of pleasure. The happiness you get out of doing nobler actions. That would be higher forms of pleasure. Therefore, Mill has this very famous statement, and I like it a lot. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So we need to seek for higher forms of pleasure. We cannot be just satisfied like a pig. A pig is satisfied by just eating. So our pleasure should not be limited to that. So that is why you may be satisfied just with the lower forms of pleasure, but that is not acceptable. So better to be a human being dissatisfied. Seek for higher forms of pleasure even if you are not satisfied. Always go on the lookout for it. Whereas don't get satisfied like the pig in the lower forms of pleasure like the food. So the same thing is also, it's better to be a Socrates, better to be a wise man. A wise man always seeks higher forms of pleasure, not just lower forms of pleasure. A fool is the one who just is contented with the lower forms of pleasure. So a contented fool is no better than a dissatisfied Socrates. A dissatisfied wise man. Now, but there is a problem here. Now, how do we rank pleasure? How do we decide what is higher form of pleasure and a lower form of pleasure? People may drastically differ from one another in deciding what is higher or what is lower. So, determining the quality of pleasure is also not easy, in as much as determining the quantity of pleasure is not easy. Now, we also have a third person called Peter Singer. He proposes what is known as preference utilitarianism. Now, Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher, contemporary philosopher. He is not interested in quantifying pleasure or in distinguishing pleasure in terms of quality. Rather, he comes with the idea of preference satisfaction. Now, what maximizes people's preference satisfaction? People have different kinds of preferences in life. Does this action maximize their preference satisfaction? If so, then it would be a right action. The advantage of this position is it avoids the difficulty in quantifying pleasure or ranking pleasure. But then there is also a problem, because some people may have certain preferences that may be morally objectionable. Now, we know people who may have preferences to torture people, and they may say they get satisfied by that. So, but that is objectionable. Or we know some people have preferences in pedophilia, and that is morally objectionable. So therefore, we need to have, besides happiness, we need to have other criteria to have this preference satisfaction, like rights and justice. So that would be a problem with preference utilitarianism. Now, there are two forms of utilitarianism, just like we had two forms of ethical egoism. Normally, the act utilitarianism is associated with Bentham, and the rule utilitarianism is associated with Mill. This is pretty similar to what we discussed in ethical egoism. Act utilitarianism looks at the individual act. Does act A promote maximum happiness for the greatest number of people than act B? Then, of course, act A is the right action. They may have certain rules of thumb, just like do not harm innocents and so on, but that is not predominant. Whereas rule utilitarianism would say, well, by adhering to some rules, do we maximize the happiness of the vast majority of people? Then to live by those rules are the right actions. So that would be the difference between act utilitarianism and the rule utilitarianism. Let us now apply the theory. Let us imagine there is a deadly terrorist who is terrorizing the city you live in. Now the police is trying hard to capture him, but of no use. He always escapes them. And the more he is set free, the more danger people's lives are going to be. Because people are going to live in fear, because he can attack anyone, he can kill anybody, he is terrorizing the whole city. So now the situation is not one of pleasure for vast majority of people, but of pain. Now the police have to catch this deadly terrorist. If they fail to do so, people's lives are going to be miserable. But all their attempts are made futile. A special police task force is called for, and they decide, in order to capture the terrorist, there is only one way out: arrest all his family members, his wife and 7 children, and then send him a warning. If you don't turn yourself in, we will start torturing your family members one by one, and if needed, we will put them to death. Is the police action a right action? Are they justified in torturing or even killing the family members of the terrorist? They are innocent. They have nothing to do with this terrorist activity. If you are an act utilitarian, you would look at only that individual act. You would say, well, it is better for the sake of the vast majority of people. In order that the vast majority of the people or the greatest number of people get happiness, we can torture and even kill, if necessary, the family members of the terrorist. Now, if you are a rule utilitarian, you will apply a rule. The rule would be this: you can arrest, torture, and kill innocent family members of a deadly terrorist in order to arrest him. Now you ask whether this rule can be followed consistently. Then you ask yourself whether this would promote maximum happiness to the vast majority of people or the greatest number of people. Your answer is likely to be no, because in the long run, now people are going to be afraid of the police task force. Anyone from their own family can be captured and tortured and killed if they want to get hold of another family member who has wronged someone. So you would say that it would be a wrong action. So there is a huge difference in your choice if you are an act utilitarian and if you are a rule utilitarian. Now let us evaluate the utilitarian theory in general. Again, let us use the same three criteria: whether it is consistent with considered moral judgment, whether it is consistent with common moral experience, whether it is useful in problem solving. It does not fulfill the first criterion. It is not consistent with considered moral judgment. Now, in the consistent moral judgment, people would say justice demands that happiness be distributed fairly. You cannot harm one person to make the greatest number of people happy. Now, sometimes we have read in the newspapers, if there is a communal riot between two communities, you arrest one innocent person in order to end the communal riot. And you say, well, we have got the wrongdoer in our custody, now stop the riot. It promotes happiness for the greatest number of people, but at whose cost? There is an innocent victim. Now remember, institutionally we tend to do that often. We victimize some individual innocence in order to protect others in the institution. Time and again we do that. I can give you several examples. Now, again, let us take the example of that homeless person. In order to promote happiness for the greatest number of people, which means the family members of those 5 patients under your care who need organ transplant, you just kill one person. Can you do that? Is it just? Does not justice demand that everybody deserves happiness, including the innocent homeless person? Now, therefore, it is not consistent with the considered moral judgment. It also fails the last criterion. It is not useful in problem solving, because what maximizes happiness or what maximizes preferences is not very clear. People may have different preference for happiness. Some might say they derive happiness from enjoying a good party, enjoying good dinner. Others may say, well, they may derive happiness by spending the money on some charity rather than having a party. Now, how do you resolve this? It's not really helpful in assessing what maximizes happiness. Nevertheless, it fulfills the requirement of the second criterion. It is consistent with the common moral experience. The common moral experience is that we often tend to protect and promote the interest of the maximum number of people. So it fulfills the requirement of the second criterion. What do we learn from utilitarianism? The first thing is, utilitarianism focuses on the consequences. So consequences do matter. So it is also important for us to think before we act. What kind of consequences would my action produce? Is it going to be good for the greatest number of people? Is it going to give happiness for the greatest number of people? Or at least is it going to minimize pain for the greatest number of people? So consequences do matter, and it forms part of our moral decisions, and they are important. To that extent, we learn something important from utilitarianism. It also gives us the principle of impartiality. Unlike ethical egoism, which is partial to oneself, it puts one's interest above the interest of others. Utilitarianism is impartial. Everybody's interest is important. At least it considers the interest of everyone, though it may not be able to fulfill the interest of everyone. It fulfills the interest of the greatest number of people, but at least in principle, it looks out for everyone's interests, not just my own interests. It also adopts the principle of beneficence and social welfare because it is interested in the happiness of the maximum number of people or the greatest number of people. It leads to a social welfare ideal, to be kind to people generally at large, not only to the limited number of people, but to the greatest number of people. So these are certain things that we learn from utilitarianism. And with this, I conclude today's lecture. Thank you for your kind attention. Now I'll stop sharing this session. I shall be giving some time for question or answer. So you are welcome to ask me questions during that session. I will not be sharing I will not be recording the question answer session at that point in time because it will take too much of MB. So I once again thank you for your kind patience. So if you have got any question, now you can raise your hand and you can ask me a question. I'll try to address that, or you can type in the chat box. If you're not able to speak, you can type in the chat box and I will address your queries. Thank you everyone and have a very good day.